What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. So Riot put up some graphs a while back that were made from some spell input data recorded from players across all regions and ranks to determine and demonstrate the differences in how players from those different places or skill levels use their abilities. And it's actually really interesting because there's a lot larger of a difference between how abilities are used than I really expected in the first place. And from looking at the data, you can actually take things away that will help you make the most of your abilities in the future. There's definitely a lot to be learned here. And so today we're taking a look over what Riot discussed and why changing the way that you use your abilities could be a super powerful way to help you make the most out of your champion. And if you guys enjoyed the video, definitely hit that like button, and if you don't enjoy the video, feel free to hit that dislike button too, and let's get started. So the information we're taking a look at today is all gathered from one particular statistic that Riot have been collecting, which is the exact number of times every player in the world uses their abilities in one particular game. Although that sounds like somewhat useless or at least pretty random information for Riot to be gathering, it's actually really surprising how much that one single figure changes based on average rank or what region someone is playing in. Jeopardy and Riot Nitsuabu were in the process of gathering data on just about everything that happens in league matches in general, and it was only when they started looking into specific statistics that they realized how weird the results actually were. The fact that the data changes so much between each ELO group allows us to draw conclusions about how most players view abilities and what players could do to improve their gameplay and potentially even climb to the higher ranks themselves. So the first dataset Riot shared was about Riven exclusively, which is a great starting point since she has both low cooldowns and no mana costs, so players aren't really limited whatsoever all that much in terms of how often you use your abilities by outside factors. And being good on Riven of course means getting the most out of your abilities. She's very ability dependent of course, and requires a mix of both mechanics and timing to use effectively. And this particular dataset can't really explain how players sequence their abilities together in different ranks, but it definitely does let us compare the frequency of spell casts with different players of different skill levels. So the question really is, how does rank change as you increase the number of spell casts, specifically for Riven's Q, in this case Broken Wings? Well, the answer is that on average, the more often players cast Riven's Q, the higher rank they are likely to be. The graph that Riot shared clearly shows that on average, lower ranked players will cast Riven's Q a lot less often, and higher elo players are going to be mashing it just constantly. Now, since this is a dataset, you definitely have to consider the percentiles as well. You know, there's definitely going to be outliers, say for example bronze players that mash Q every time it's off cooldown, so it's not like spamming Q all day just straight up makes you a high diamond player. At the same time, there will be a lot of diamond players who maybe don't cast their Q all that often, instead maybe playing a little bit more conservative and waiting for the perfect time to use the ability. So the data isn't perfect because of course not all great Riven players are going to be spamming Q. That being said though, as long as we're taking a look at the averages, Riven players tend to press Q more often the better that they get. And this could be for a different number of reasons. Maybe higher ranked players use it more often because they always just spam it to get back to lane faster, whereas lower elo players maybe just walk back to lane, or maybe higher elo Riven players just want to deal the absolute maximum DPS by keeping it off cooldown whenever possible. Unfortunately, data gathering like this just never really tells us the whole story, but it does give some interesting insight that lets us maybe make some predictions about what players of different skill levels are doing in different games. For example, the same story with Riven with the data applies to her E and also to her W and Ultimate, although a little bit less drastically. And that lends a little bit of credit to the theory that higher elo Riven players are using Q for mobility, since they're also doing the same thing with Riven's E, which is another free dash with a low cooldown and no mana cost attached to it. The general takeaway from that would suggest that yes, higher ranked players do use their abilities more often, but in actuality it does depend a lot on which champion is being played in particular. High utility spells such as the crowd control mechanics used by support champions are often used less frequently by the higher ranks rather than more frequently like we saw with Riven. The example that Riot uses to demonstrate this effect is Thresh's Q, Death Sentence. And as you can see from the graph here, the number of times that Q is used per minute on average notably decreases as you climb higher up in the certain ranks. And the justification behind this is a lot easier to figure out than why Riven players maybe spam more abilities. It's really just because Thresh's hook is powerful even when you're not using it. Think about it this way. You're playing in a bot lane against an enemy Thresh, he uses his hook and maybe he misses completely or hits a minion or whatever. Either way, it doesn't matter because you now have the knowledge that his death sentence is on cooldown and you can't use it again for quite some time. And that gives you a really awesome window of opportunity here where you can maybe force a fight or have the advantage that his main piece of crowd control is just unable to use. And in lower ranks, Thresh players are maybe a little bit more optimistic. They'll throw out a Q whenever they can because they know that it's potentially likely to help them get a kill if they do land it. But in reality, holding onto the Q is actually much more powerful a lot of the time because the enemy bot lane has to play around the fact that you could use your hook at any second. And as soon as you throw out a Thresh Q and miss, the enemy team can play really aggressively, like trying to engage on you, go for a trade, or just maybe force you under tower and make you miss a bunch of CS. Well, if you're holding your Q, the enemy team just has to play a little bit more passively, stay safely behind their own minions out of the fear that you might land a hook on them. And this is the case in higher ranks where Thresh players are only really going to throw out their hook if they're sure that they can land it, or if they're very positive that they can, or if they aren't concerned about being punished for it, say maybe if they have a jungler nearby that could help out if the enemy team decides to go aggressive on them. It's kind of a win-win situation to use Death Sentence in this way. If you don't have any backup nearby, you don't think you can land the hook, maybe just hold on to it to make your enemies play more defensively and focus on applying that pressure instead. And this trend isn't exclusive to Thresh either. The same happens for most big utility spells actually, particularly on support champions, since it's a lane where you don't have to constantly fight all the time unless you really want to, and so peeling for teammates is a really big focus. Riot also included graphs for Janna's Q and Nami's Q, which both operate on the same principle and showed the same results. Sure, you can use maybe Howling Gale or Aqua Prison to try and go for a pick or maybe some poke or try to engage a fight, but oftentimes holding them to disengage is much more effective and actually makes them a lot easier to land too, because it's easier to aim a skill shot at a target that is moving towards you, so higher elo players just don't tend to use these abilities as often. Another ability that higher elo players tend to hold, rather than use easily, is Draven's E, Stand Aside, although this is for maybe different reasons to the support abilities. The idea here is that there are a lot of abilities in the game that are used for utility purposes, even though they happen to be on carry champions, and Draven's the first example that Riot gives, because Stand Aside is actually kind of an inefficient ability. It has a really long cooldown, has a really high mana cost compared to his other abilities, and on top of that, it doesn't really do all that much damage. So despite that, lower elo players will tend to get a bit tense in fights and end up spamming the hell out of all their abilities in order to maximize their damage as fast as possible, but that's actually completely the wrong way to use the Stand Aside ability. The utility that it offers is there to do different things, like maybe peeling for yourself or interrupting escapes like a Tristana rocket jump or something like that. Especially higher elo players are waiting for very specific moments or situations, or better yet, outcomes before they use their Stand Aside. So the average number of times it's cast in a game will drop the higher in the ranks that you go. The same goes for other utility abilities on carries. Another example from Riot was Fiora's Riposte. In the lower ranks, players might use it for damage, whereas in the higher elos, players are going to use it to counter that key crowd control ability or prevent some big burst damage from hitting them. So naturally, it's used way less often in general, just so that it will be saved for those key situations. So the key here is that really using your abilities efficiently just matters so much and can have such a large impact in your games. Now, we've also talked a lot about the skill differences here, but another interesting variable in the data that Riot collected here that shows a lot of difference on certain champions between regions. So, of course, the big outlier here, no surprises there, is going to be Korea, and Riot uses Udyr as their main comparison. So in all other regions than Korea, the higher you go in terms of rank, Udyr players will use his ultimate, Phoenix Stance, a lot less. In Korea, it's actually the opposite story, so the Q is used way less and the Phoenix Stance is used a lot more often as you climb up the higher ranks. Now this could show maybe a difference in the playstyle of certain champions, like maybe Koreans prefer to play Udyr as more of a split pusher champion, using his ultimate for wave clear, or maybe Korea just sucks at Udyr and the West has a better idea of how to optimize the use of his kit. Unfortunately, the data can't tell us that for sure. It does at least provide something that's pretty interesting and to watch out for. They also provide graphs showing the use of Trundle's abilities in each MMR, comparing Korean players and the rest of the world, and it showed that Korean players tended to use his Chomp a lot less often as you climb up the Korean ladder, and instead they would use his Pillar of Ice a lot more, which is the opposite story in the rest of the world, where in the reverse situation is Q is used a lot more often. Now the simplest explanation here is of course that it's probably a difference based on where Trundle is being played. The fact that Pillar of Ice is used more often than Chomp implies that high MMR Korean players prefer to use Trundle as a support pick, where they can often use the Pillar for CC, but don't really get the chance to walk into melee range for a Chomp. On the other hand, you've got the rest of the world that mostly prefers Trundle top, the perfect time to spam Q for damage in lane. Pretty interesting sort of difference between the regions there. Either way though, that just about wraps up all the information that Riot shared regarding spell inputs and kind of just our thoughts in general, so hopefully maybe you learned something or just thought that the statistics were interesting. Either way though, looks like that's going to be it for me. If you guys enjoyed the video, drop a like, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.